Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. Immigrants from outside the EU must add to Britain's quality of life. That's the rather stark message of the government. Immigration Minister Damian Green has set out the government's more selective approach to immigration, saying that those who settle here may have to earn a minimum of £31,000. It's part of the government's plans to cut net immigration from 242,000 per year to somewhere near tens of thousands a year. Before I introduce this week's guest, let's take a more detailed look at Damian Green's speech last week.
For the past decade, the immigration debate in this country...
People who want to come to Britain must add something to the quality of life in the UK. That's now the message coming from the coalition government. In his speech to the Policy Exchange last week, Immigration Minister Damian Green referred to a recent report by the government's Migration Advisory Committee, which found there were up to 23 fewer jobs for British workers for every additional 100 working migrants coming from outside the EU. For him, he said that the figures disprove the old assumption that immigration adds to GDP and is a good thing for the economy. In the speech, he said he wanted to create a national consensus around immigration and that importing economic dependency on the state is unacceptable. The government wants to cut net migration to an annual rate of tens of thousands, which was last seen in the 1990s. At the core is the idea that you only get in if you're good enough, one that has driven policy in countries like Australia and America. But Green and the government are likely to be criticised for focusing on immigration rights for the wealthy, despite the lower paid also paying their way and keeping Britain moving. And the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants has said that any minimum income threshold will be a hammer blow to the human rights of cross-border partners and their families.
With me to discuss this is Habib Rahman, who's Chief Executive of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Welcome to the show. We also have Glennie, who's a Research Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research. And we have Simon Ross, who's the Chief Executive of the Population Matters. And finally, we have Juan Camilo, who's Migrant Rights Network. Thanks for being on the show, all of you. Simon, so do you think it's a good idea that essentially only very rich people will get into the country?
I think it's a good idea to cut numbers. England's near the top of the league table in terms of population density in the European Union, and that has an impact on our quality of life in terms of housing, transport, employment, green spaces, public services. So we can't just open the door and have more and more people sort of pouring in. I think it's good to keep the numbers down, and it's tough. It's tough to have to do that, and it's tough to have those measures, but I think they are appropriate.
Habib, what do you think?
What we have heard from the minister is political rhetoric. What he can't do, he can't control EU migration because freedom of movement from EU people. And what is underneath all these rhetorics, he's putting pressure on families, the human rights of families, British people living here, settled people settled here for generations. It will impact on them. What he's suggesting, if somebody chooses to marry a non-EU spouse or establish a partnership with a non-EU person, to bring them here, they have to show more than £25,000 earning. That's infringing on the human rights of people, fundamental human rights of people, and we are very concerned about that. Population, we talk about generation of migrants. All the research shows they have contributed positively to both economically and socially to Britain. And migrants has been good for Britain, and across the political parties, they agree. The managed migration, we agree, we should have proper management of migration. And migration management doesn't mean only that you allow the rich people to come in here. Managed migration is irrespective of everyone, see what is good for Britain. You mentioned about, Simon, about the housing, schools and all these things. If we manage migration properly, and if we see the migrants' contribution also goes in creating the schools and the housing, then there will be no problem. And economists after economists, they said, migrants, it doesn't mean that density of population creates economic strife in a place, because economic density, and if you have productive economic forces here, then they create wealth for everyone, prosperity for everyone.
Alex, let me just take you back to a point that Habib made right at the beginning of his contribution there. Isn't there a kind of implied racism here, that they can't control European immigration, so whatever your income, if you're from Europe, you can come. But outside, there's some other criteria being instituted.
I don't think it's necessarily racism that's informing the policies, but as Habib said, there are very few categories of migrants that the government is now able to clamp down on to achieve its stated targets of reducing migration to the tens of thousands from the hundreds of thousands. Unfortunately, the categories that they do have leeway to close down on are for ones that are open to migrants from outside the EU, but they're also the ones that are open to the most economically valuable migrants, so the high-skilled migrants and those coming in to study, which puts the government in a very difficult position. And I think it's a mistake for them to focus on a numerical target rather than trying to design a migration policy that will allow the best and the brightest to come in, benefit the UK, but also benefit from living in the UK.
Simon, how do you know that the rich are the best and the brightest? I mean, there are innumerable cases where very poor people come in, make an incredible contribution to the economy, sometimes become rich, sometimes don't, but they certainly weren't rich when they got here.
I think that the financial level is about employers deciding who's valuable and pulling in people that they really need. At that sort of level, if they could go internally, they would do. And I think it's about encouraging employers to train people locally to bring in the 2.5 million unemployed in the UK rather than going abroad for people that they can get either more cheaply or without training. I think we need to encourage employers to use our own human resources in this country rather than simply importing more and more while leaving a large number of people in the UK without jobs.
Juan, what do you make of this? I mean, you must know many cases of people who are making a contribution to the economy but would be excluded under this regulation.
Of course, and it's very often people who are very valuable to society because of the specific type of work that they do. And so, for example, most overseas nurses working in the UK would not be eligible to remain after 5 years if some of the income thresholds were to be instituted. They would have to leave the country, and I think a lot of people would agree that nurses provide a very valuable service to most of the UK. A similar thing happens with teachers, where there's lots of teachers from outside the EU, and yet only in London will they have the sort of wages, be able to get those sort of wages that will allow them to stay and to continue delivering those services that are needed. But even this concept of selectivity is very, very complicated because it relies on this notion that we can very early on identify who is going to be the person who's going to be super successful in their areas of expertise. Now, football has been brought up as an example, and football you generally know by when somebody's 16 years old, whether they're going to be great or not. But many other professions, you really don't. You just have a pool of talent. Some of those will end up being super successful, some of them don't. And if you're just going to wait until they have become super successful and then invite them, you're going to miss out from a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential for development.
And there's something that's slightly obnoxious about this whole super successful, because actually the society actually hangs together, actually runs, because lots of not super successful people work very hard to make it run.
Yes, it is. For example, I agree with what Juan and Alex was saying, that you don't value the nurses of this world, or care workers of this world, because their salary, if you just judge by the salaries, and you value the Fred Goodwins of this world, so the money is not the criteria, you judge people coming in. Other point I would like to make, the students, for example, already MEC, Migration Advisory Committee, which is government advisory committee, is talking about present measures put in to control students from non-EU countries will cost £2 billion to the education industry here, universities and colleges and all this thing. So it is not very intelligent idea to control just by the money and then leave to employers who they choose and put a barrier, with artificial barrier on salaries and income. And I talked about the family rights, family reunion rights of people. They're talking about the proposal average earning over £25,000 to show for spouses to bring in to sponsor their spouses to this country. Half of the population in here, they don't earn over £25,000. And who are you talking about? You're talking about young people. Young graduates comes out and their level of earning is about 18 to 22. So what happens is you're leaving out everyone not only half, majority of the young people to sponsor their spouses on the basis of on the basis of their earnings. This is neither fair nor good for Britain. You know, the immigration, there should be a managed migration policy, I said. And there should be properly thought out managed migration policy looking at the protection of human rights of people, basic rights of people, and not driven by just population control. We know the managed migration policy, we had a small island and all these remarks. There are other places, you know, one of the economists was talking about, London is one of the most densely populated city in the country, and London is one of the most prosperous city in the country. So it's not just population drives everything. If we manage things properly, then we can succeed.
Alex, what about this, the provision about who you can marry? I mean, unless I've got this wrong, won't the effect of this law be that if one of the best and the brightest decides to marry somebody who isn't in their income bracket, they're going to suddenly have a difficulty in their immigration status?
Yes, the policies haven't been announced yet, but the proposals do suggest that this could affect a large number of UK citizens who want to marry someone from outside the EU who doesn't meet that income threshold, which is an infringement on people's human rights. And
I mean, Simon, that's indefensible, isn't it? I mean, perhaps if some, a minor figure in the Saudi royal family decides to marry their maid, they'll get chucked out. I mean, to pick on a kind of picturesque example.
I can see it's a sort of curious rule, but I think there's been an element of abuse of people systematically going back to perhaps the country of origin of their community in another continent and bringing in spouses. Perhaps, we've heard about arranged marriages, forced marriages. We have to ask, who are all these young people who are seeking to marry, not just in the UK, not just in the UU, but in another continent altogether? It's a sort of peculiar thing, and I think it's trying to limit that sort of conveyor belt of bringing in spouses on such a systematic basis.
There's a lot of trouble, though, Juan, down the road here, isn't there? Because, I mean, in a city like London, for instance, it's a fantastically multicultural city. There are very large numbers of young people working here. They meet, they mix together. Australians, marry Filipinos. It's. How I don't see how it. Do you see how it's going to work?
Well, just to get something clear here, it's that the person who needs to meet the minimum income threshold, from what I understand, is the person who's living in the UK and wants to bring somebody from abroad. So in the case of the Saudi person, if he has a lot of money, he will have no problem. The problem is for people who are not earning above this threshold, which is quite high. It leaves outside half of the UK population, and we're talking here not about migrants, but about everybody who is living in the UK. So British-born people, if they're young, starting a career, and they meet somebody when they're in the gap year outside in some part of the world, and they want to marry that person and bring them to live with them in the UK, they won't be able to do it if these proposals go forward as they are. So we've had a lot of people getting in touch with us, people who are British, not migrants, but it is something that covers the whole of the population, and it's selecting exclusively on your income level. So it's basically the amount of money that you have will give you access to certain rights. So we're starting to bring stratify rights according to your income levels, and surely that raises lots of questions about the sort of society that we want to be, especially at a time like now when we're questioning this drive where kind of like money determines success. So yeah, it is going to bring a lot of issues and potentially cases in the courts.
I mean, Simon, don't you feel that doesn't it make you feel uncomfortable? I mean, famously on the Statue of Liberty in America, it says, "Bring me your poor, bring me your huddled masses, bring me the refuse of your shores." I mean, this is counter to a whole sort of strand of, I would have thought, for many people, a dominant strand of thinking about these issues.
It's really a limitation on people's freedom to live where they like, that's for sure. And it's looking at the rights of people to live where they like against the rights of people living in this country. What's happening worldwide is migration is going up and up and up. partly because transport is easier, partly because of global communications, partly because of things like climate change and impoverishment in some countries. So there is this real pressure for people to move from some parts of the world to others, particularly the UK, where we've got a reasonable high standard of living, where English, the international language, is our natural language. So there's this huge pressure. And if we do try and improve circumstances and conditions in this country, including the welfare state, including housing conditions and so on, we just have to have that limit and stop the numbers going up and up and up, given that we're already, one of the most densely populated countries in Europe.
Alex, let me, in response, but let me bring you back to a point that you made earlier about the proportion of EU immigration and non-EU immigration. Even if we accepted that there are no problems with this, would it work in terms of numbers?
I don't think it would work in terms of numbers, just the control that the government has over who moves in from the EU is also matched by a lack of control over who leaves the UK. And in recent years, we've seen that emigration levels of UK residents and nationals have fallen, perhaps in response to the economic situation and other factors as well, which really has a bearing on net migration targets. So even if the government was able to bring down the numbers of immigrants, they might not be able to do anything about the numbers of immigrants, and net migration levels could still rise. So I think this overwhelming focus on the numbers is problematic. And instead, we need to be looking at, how to build a better migration system that sends signals that Britain is open to those who are willing to come and contribute. And I think that the policy measures that are being announced are sending quite a worrying signal. They're saying that Britain is closed to people from abroad who want to come and work here and study here and then take their knowledge and expertise back to their own countries or to move on somewhere else, which I think will be damaging in the long term.
Is that your view?
Yes, that's my view. I agree with Alex. Before that, I want to, with respect, mention that the viewers do not get the wrong impression about what you said about marriage. The forced marriage, anyone in right mind cannot condone any forced marriage, and we all abhor in a civilized society forced marriage. It's nothing to do with forced marriage. Arranged marriage is an institution in some parts of the world. People get arranged, people meet here in different ways, and that's how they meet their partners, and their arrangement take place. So that's their people wishes. We are talking about British people and settled people here. They want to establish a family, the relationship of the person of their choice. And this is fundamental right enshrined in the international law. And to put barriers to that, just to control immigration number is not fair, and it's not right that the people. And the government has tried in different ways, as Juan was mentioning, that we took government to the court and the government laws. They wanted to bring up the marriageable age for non-EU migrants, both British citizens, those who are getting married with non-EU migrants, both parties, over 21, and they failed because it is interfering into people's basic fundamental human rights, which is enshrined in international law. So we cannot very lightly deal with international law that we have achieved for very long time, that just to control immigration numbers. So that's the point I want to make, Simon. And otherwise, talking about numbers, it will be very difficult. And the government made a mistake even during the election time when they dogmatically said they will bring down the net migration figures from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands. They have taken into account international students, for example. About 300,000 international students comes here, which is the student industry itself to Britain value is around 40 billion pounds estimated. Fees alone give 6 to 8 billion pounds. So it's just, cutting the interest of Britain. So it's not the best way to go about it. If the student comes, they are temporary migrants. They come in here, they study. They are ambassadors. They come here and create links with the countries they come from. And it's a stupid idea to control those kind of things. So I think the number game will not work. And I have been saying again and again, let's talk about managed migration policy, where we have managed migration policy which is fair to everyone without interfering into people's rights and control migration in the interest of Britain, British people, and migrants themselves, which is very important.
Okay, Simon, the first point that was made there, that this may end up in a legal mess with breaches of human rights. Do you accept that that's a danger with the policy as it's proposed?
I mean, this is all about, you know, managing people and what they want to do. So human rights is a huge element, and we do have our commitments. I think with students and with employees, I mean, they're the other routes. And I think if they come and then go again after a few years, that's absolutely fine. That isn't the issue. It's the fact that it's when they come and then stay and then get settlement rights. So if we can end that permanent settlement, if we can say, yeah, absolutely come, you know, we'll give you our skills, you know, it benefits you, it benefits us, but then you go back home again and use those skills for the benefit of your own country, I think that's highly appropriate. I think the family stuff is definitely harder. You have those relationships, and the government's really struggling because it can't control EU migration, it can't control immigration, it can just control, you know, the people coming in. I think family is harder, I recognise that.
There is a flaw in that thinking also. The people come in and they settle here and cut settlement rights. For example, when the students come here, there were rules to switch here, that if the economy needs, because you are getting trained people here, they're coming in here studying overseas students, and if there are avenues open for them to settle here, they contribute to the economy. Economy works in a different ways, and economists will say this is it's not an intelligent way of controlling migration, that you come in here, you are like an automaton. You come in here and you stay here for some time, you finish your purpose, go back. People move, and we have seen throughout the history, the people came in here, and there is today in Guardian, the article named several people, like Marks and Spencer, the person who established Marks and Spencer, came as a young refugee and selling things on the street. So those kind of things, thinking about bringing people like an automaton, they contribute to the economy for a certain time. Coming students that go back straight away after they finish their studies. There are good ways of dealing with it. That's why I've been repeating again and again, manage migration policy, think through the managed migration policy, don't be driven by the political dogma or racism of immigration control, and then and deal with it in proper way.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring the discussion to a halt there. Interesting though it's been, but I'm sure we'll be returning to this issue in future programmes. But for the moment, thank you to all my guests in the studio, to you for watching, and I hope you'll be with us next week.